The sun was starting to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink as a sleek sedan made its way through the quiet streets of a suburban neighborhood. Behind the wheel sat a man who had spent most of his day fighting for justice in courtrooms. He wasn't just any lawyer. He was the Deputy Attorney General, someone whose job it was to stand up for people's rights and fight against unfairness in the system. Today had been no different. He'd argued passionately in front of a judge, defending cases that mattered. Deeply to him, cases about equality, fairness, and protecting those who often felt voiceless. Now, as he drove home, all he wanted was to unwind, maybe grab dinner, and reflect on the small victories of the day. But fate had something else planned. As he approached an intersection, bright flashes of blue and red lights suddenly lit up his rearview mirror. Confused, he glanced at the speedometer. He hadn't been speeding. His seatbelt was securely fastened, and he hadn't run any stop signs or traffic signals. So why was he being pulled over? He sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped unexpectedly, but each time it happened, it left him feeling uneasy. Living in a world where your skin color could make others see you differently wasn't easy. It was something he'd learned to live with, but that didn't mean he accepted it without question. 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car. One was tall and broad-shouldered, while the other was leaner, with sharp features and a scowl that seemed permanently etched onto his face. They walked toward the sedan with heavy boots thudding against the pavement. There was no friendly greeting, no explanation for why they were stopping him. Instead, one of them leaned into the driver's window, his tone dripping with hostility. License and registration. The taller officer barked, not even bothering to introduce himself. His eyes scanned the interior of the car, taking in the neat dashboard, the leather seats, and the suit the driver wore. The look in his eyes said it all. He didn't approve. The driver reached calmly into his pocket and handed over his documents. "I wasn't speeding, officer," he said politely. "Is there a specific reason I've been pulled over?" But instead of answering, the officer let out a scoff. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "A person driving a fancy car like this? Doesn't sit right with me?" The words stung, but the driver kept his cool. He knew better than to react impulsively. Still, he couldn't help but feel frustrated. Fancy car? What did that even mean? Was it because of how he looked? Or was it simply easier to pick on someone when you thought they wouldn't fight back? Before he could respond, the second officer chimed in from behind the patrol car. Probably bought it with stolen cash. He sneered, laughing cruelly. "People like you always think you're better than everyone else." The driver clenched his jaw but forced himself to stay composed. These kinds of comments weren't new to him. Over the years, he'd heard them countless times in stores, at work, even during casual conversations. But hearing them now, coming from someone wearing a badge, felt particularly cutting. "I'm the Deputy Attorney General," he replied firmly, meeting the officer's gaze. "If you have no legitimate cause for stopping me, I'll be leaving now." For a moment, there was silence. Then the 2 officers exchanged glances, smirking as if sharing some private joke. Their body language screamed arrogance, like they believed they were untouchable. And perhaps in their minds they were. After all, who would believe him over them? They were the ones with uniforms, badges, and guns. To the outside world, they represented authority. But deep down, both men carried prejudices that colored everything they did. What neither of them realized, however, was that this encounter wasn't going to end quietly. The driver had already started recording the interaction on his phone, knowing full well how important evidence could be in situations like this. As the officers continued to mock him, unaware of the growing audience watching online, tensions began to rise. Little did anyone know, this seemingly routine traffic stop would spiral into something far bigger and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. As the driver sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, he couldn't shake off the feeling of being treated like a criminal. The 2 officers outside his window weren't acting like law enforcement anymore. They were acting like bullies. Their words cut deeper than any insult he'd faced before because they came wrapped in authority. It wasn't just about him. It was about what their actions represented, the misuse of power, the ingrained biases that turned every day moments into confrontations. The taller officer glanced at the license and registration papers the driver had handed over. Instead of examining them carefully or even thanking him for complying, he tossed them onto the dashboard with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "This doesn't prove anything," he muttered under his breath. His partner chuckled from behind, leaning casually against the patrol car as if this entire situation was some kind of entertainment for them. "Let me see your phone," the taller officer demanded suddenly, his tone sharp and commanding. The driver blinked, caught off guard. "My phone? Why do you need my phone?" "Because I said so," the officer snapped back, stepping closer to the car. His voice carried an edge of impatience now, like he was done pretending to follow protocol. "Hand it over." The driver hesitated. He knew handing over his phone without a warrant was unnecessary, but he also knew arguing might escalate things further. Still, something inside him refused to give in completely. Quietly, he reached for his phone, opened the camera app, and pressed record. If these officers thought they could intimidate him into submission, they were wrong. Every word they spoke, every action they took, would be documented not just for himself, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar position someday. "What are you doing?" the officer barked, noticing the movement. "Before." The driver could answer. The officer yanked the door open and snatched the phone out of his hand. "You think you're smart, huh? Recording us, that's resisting arrest? Resisting arrest?" The accusation hit like a punch to the gut. The driver stared at him, incredulous. How could simply recording an interaction be considered resisting arrest? But before he could protest, the second officer stepped forward, his earlier smirk replaced by a scowl. "Yeah, we've seen your type before," he sneered. "Always trying to play the victim. Always looking for attention." The driver felt his chest tighten. These men weren't interested in facts or fairness. They were building a narrative, one where he was the problem, not them. And worse, they seemed confident that no one would question their version of events. After all, they wore badges. People trusted them. Who would believe a stranger over two officers of the law? But then something unexpected happened. A young woman walking her dog nearby stopped when she noticed the commotion. She pulled out her own phone and began filming. Her presence startled the officers, who exchanged uneasy glances. One of them waved her away. "Keep moving," he growled. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," she shot back, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I'm recording this." That small act of defiance sparked a chain reaction. Within minutes, more bystanders gathered, some curious, others outraged. Phones were held up, capturing every detail. Someone live-streamed the scene on social media, tagging local news outlets and civil rights organizations. Comments flooded. And almost instantly, "Is this really happening?" One viewer typed, "Why is this man being harassed?" Another asked. Back at the center of it all, the driver remained calm, though his heart raced. He knew better than to provoke the officers. Instead, he focused on speaking clearly and firmly, ensuring his voice carried enough authority to counter theirs. "I've complied with everything you've asked," he reminded them. "I haven't broken any laws. You have no reason to detain me." But the officers weren't listening. Their egos had been bruised by the growing crowd and the cameras. Rolling. Backup units arrived shortly after, summoned by the original pair who claimed the driver was aggressive and uncooperative. Each new arrival added to the chaos, their voices overlapping as they shouted contradictory orders. "Step out of the car!" One yelled, "Put your hands where we can see them." Another commanded. By now, the street looked like a scene from a movie. Red and blue lights flashed everywhere, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Neighbors peeked through curtains, wondering what was going on. Social media buzzed with activity, hashtags like #UnjustStop and #AccountabilityForAll spreading rapidly. The video clips being shared showed the driver sitting quietly in his car, surrounded by officers who appeared increasingly agitated. One of the newer arrivals, a sergeant, judging by the stripes on his uniform, tried to take control of the situation. He approached the driver cautiously, his expression less hostile than the others. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" he asked, his tone measured. The driver nodded, grateful for the chance to speak. "I was pulled over for no valid reason," he explained. "These officers have been disrespectful and unprofessional. I've done nothing wrong." The sergeant frowned, glancing at his colleagues. Whatever he saw or didn't see in their behavior made him hesitate. For a brief moment, it seemed like sanity might prevail. Maybe this whole mess could end peacefully. But then one of the original officers interrupted, pointing accusingly at the driver. "He's lying. He resisted our commands and tried to incite the crowd." The accusation reignited the tension. The sergeant sighed, stepping back. Whether he believed the story or not, he seemed unwilling to challenge his fellow officers. Instead, he motioned for the driver to step out of the car. Reluctantly, the driver complied, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. As soon as he exited the vehicle, he was shoved roughly toward a waiting patrol car. Hands cuffed behind his back, he was pushed inside while the crowd erupted in murmurs of disbelief. From the back seat, the driver watched as the officers returned to their vehicles, their faces flushed with anger and embarrassment. None of them looked directly at him now. To them, he was invisible, just another faceless person they could bully into submission. But what they failed to realize was that this encounter wasn't over. Far from it. As the patrol car drove away, the driver stared out the window, replaying the events in his mind. He thought about the people who had witnessed the stop, the videos being shared online, and the conversations that would surely follow. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing a system that allowed such behavior to happen. Demanding change. Little did he know, the fallout from this night would ripple far beyond the confines of the patrol car. Lives would be changed, reputations questioned, and secrets uncovered. And somewhere in the shadows, someone else was watching, someone who believed in justice but practiced it in ways that blurred the line between right and wrong. The patrol car sped through the streets, its tires humming against the asphalt as the driver sat silently in the back seat. His hands were still cuffed behind him, and the cold metal dug into his wrists every time the car hit a bump. Despite the discomfort, his mind raced faster than the vehicle beneath him. He replayed the events of the night over and over again, the insults, the accusations, the crowd gathering to film everything. It was surreal, like watching a movie where he was both the main character and an outsider looking in at the precinct. Things only got worse. The officers who had detained him marched him inside with little regard for procedure. No one explained why he was being held or what charges, if any, were being filed against them. Instead, they led him to a small, dimly lit room and left him there without another word. The door slammed shut behind him, echoing loudly in the confined space. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing. He leaned back against the hard chair, trying to steady himself. This wasn't the first time he'd faced injustice, but it stung just as much now as it ever had. What made it worse was knowing that these men wore badges, symbols meant to represent protection and fairness. Yet here they were, abusing their power in ways that left scars far deeper than physical ones. But even as frustration bubbled inside him, he reminded himself of something important. The world was watching. Back at the scene of the traffic stop, dozens of phones had captured the encounter. Videos were already spreading online, sparking outrage across social media platforms. People were demanding answers, demanding accountability. And while sitting alone in that cold interrogation room felt isolating, he knew he wasn't truly alone. There were thousands, maybe millions, of eyes on this case now. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, chaos brewed. News vans began arriving, their bright lights illuminating the otherwise quiet street. Reporters scrambled to set up microphones and cameras, eager to get statements from anyone willing to talk. Some bystanders who had witnessed the stop recounted what they'd seen, describing how the officers acted aggressively despite the driver's calm demeanor. Others shared snippets of the videos they'd filmed, showing the growing crowd and the heated exchange between the driver and law enforcement. inside the station. However, the officers involved seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around them. They gathered in the break room, laughing and joking about the stunt they claimed the driver had pulled. "Can you believe that guy?" one of them said, shaking his head. "Thinks he's untouchable just because he's got a fancy title." His partner smirked, sipping coffee. "Yeah, well, let's see how long his title protects him when we file our report." They high-fived each other, confident that their version of events would hold up under scrutiny. After all, they reasoned, no one would take the word of some random person over two decorated officers. That kind of arrogance had worked for them before, and they saw no reason why it wouldn't work again. What they didn't realize was that cracks were beginning to form in their carefully constructed facade. As the story gained traction online, anonymous tips started pouring in. People who had been victims of similar incidents came forward, sharing their stories and naming the same officers as perpetrators. One woman described being pulled over late at night for no reason, subjected to invasive questioning simply because of her appearance. Another man recounted how he'd been frisked in broad daylight after stepping out of a convenience store. Humiliated in front of his children, civil rights organizations quickly took notice. Lawyers and activists reached out to the driver, offering support and resources to help expose the officer's misconduct. Internal affairs within the police department launched an investigation, spurred not only by public pressure but also by mounting evidence that painted a damning picture of habitual abuse of power. Back in the interrogation room, the driver finally heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and a sergeant walked in, carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself and asked a series of standard questions: name, age, occupation, but there was no warmth in his tone, just professionalism. When the driver mentioned his position as Deputy Attorney General, the sergeant raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, he scribbled notes and then left the room without another word. Hours passed. The driver wasn't given food or water, and the lack of communication made the wait feel endless. But eventually someone arrived, a lawyer sent by one of the civil rights groups advocating for him. Through the thick glass of the interrogation room window, the driver could see relief wash over the lawyer's face when he realized the situation wasn't as dire as it could have been. With legal representation present, the officers reluctantly uncuffed the driver and allowed him to leave, with strict instructions not to discuss the incident publicly outside the precinct. Reporters swarmed him, shoving microphones in his face and firing off rapid-fire questions. "What happened tonight? Did the officers mistreat you? Do you plan to press charges?" Flashbulbs popped, blinding him momentarily. Overwhelmed but determined, he raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "I can't say much right now," he began, his voice firm despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "But I will say this: what happened tonight is bigger than me. It's about holding people accountable when they misuse their power. It's about ensuring that everyone, no matter who they are, is treated fairly under the law." The crowd erupted in applause, and the driver felt a flicker of hope amidst the turmoil. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. These officers weren't going to admit wrongdoing easily, and powerful systems often resisted change. But he also knew that exposing the truth was the first step toward justice. As he climbed into a car driven by a friend, the driver glanced back at the precinct. Inside, the officers went about their duties as usual, unaware of the ripple effects their actions had set into motion. Somewhere in the shadows, someone else was watching too, someone who believed justice required more drastic measures. Someone who thought the system was beyond saving. For now, though, the driver focused on what lay ahead. He had a team of lawyers ready to dig deep into the officers' records, uncovering years of unchecked behavior. He had supporters rallying behind him, determined to turn this moment into a movement. And most importantly, he had resolved the unshakable belief that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. The days following the traffic stop felt like a whirlwind for the Deputy Attorney General. Every waking moment was consumed by meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions. Lawyers, civil rights advocates, and journalists were all eager to hear his side of the story. Supporters flooded his social media profiles with messages of encouragement, sharing their own experiences of being mistreated by law enforcement. It was overwhelming, but in a way that made him feel less alone. Despite the outpouring of support, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about exposing a pattern of behavior, a culture within certain parts of law enforcement that thrived on intimidation and prejudice. The officers who had stopped him weren't isolated bad apples. They were part of a system that allowed such actions to go unchecked for far too long. And now, with the world watching, it was time to shine a light on that system. As investigations unfolded, details began to emerge that painted an even darker picture. Anonymous tips poured in from people claiming to have been victims of the same officers involved in the traffic stop. One woman recounted how she'd been pulled over late at night for no apparent reason, only to be subjected to invasive questioning and threats if she didn't comply. Another man described being detained during a routine shopping trip, accused of theft simply because he didn't look like he belonged in the store. Each story added another layer to the growing evidence against the officers. Internal affairs. Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together these accounts, cross-referencing them with past complaints filed against the officers. What they found was alarming, a trail of misconduct stretching back years, often dismissed or swept under the rug. Supervisors who should have intervened instead turned a blind eye, allowing the cycle of abuse to continue unchecked. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was systemic. But while the legal battle raged on, whispers of something darker began to circulate. Late one evening, as the Deputy Attorney General reviewed documents with his legal team, someone slid an envelope under the door of his office. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed words, "We know what needs to be done. Leave this to us." At first he thought it might be a prank or a misguided attempt to offer help. But as he reread the note, a chill ran down his spine. Who had sent it, and what did they mean by "leave this to us"? His instincts told him to ignore it, to focus on fighting the system through legitimate means. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or some group was planning something drastic across town. The two officers at the center of the controversy seemed blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. They returned to work as though nothing had happened, joking with colleagues and brushing off the mounting scrutiny as mere publicity. To them, it was business as usual. No one would dare challenge their authority, not really. After all, hadn't they always gotten away with it before? One night, after finishing their shift, the pair climbed into their patrol car and drove toward their favorite diner. They loved stopping there after hours, swapping stories about the idiots they dealt with during their shift. Tonight was no different. As they pulled out of the parking lot, neither noticed the black van idling across the street. Its windows were tinted, concealing whoever or whatever was inside. The van followed them silently, maintaining a safe distance as the patrol car wound its way through quiet suburban streets. At first, the officers didn't think much of it. Vans were common enough, especially in neighborhoods filled with delivery drivers and service workers. But as the minutes ticked by and the van stayed glued to their tail, unease crept in. "Hey, do you see that thing?" one of them muttered, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. His partner shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. "Probably just lost or something. Don't worry about it." But worry they did. The van kept pace with them, never speeding up or falling behind. When the officers took a sudden turn onto a deserted road, hoping to lose their follower, the van followed suit without hesitation. By now, both men were gripping the steering wheel tightly, their earlier bravado replaced by fear. Finally, they decided to confront the situation head-on. Pulling over to the side of the road, they stepped out of the patrol car, flashlights in hand. "What's your problem?" one of them shouted, aiming his flashlight at the van's windshield. "You've been following us for miles?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the van's engine roared to life. Instead of stopping, it sped forward, tires screeching as it barreled past them. The officers stumbled back, hearts pounding. As the vehicle disappeared into the night back at the precinct, rumors spread quickly among the ranks. Some claimed the van belonged to activists seeking revenge. Others whispered about vigilantes targeting corrupt cops. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. Fear had begun to seep into the department. Officers who once strutted confidently through the halls now glanced over their shoulders, wondering if they'd be next. Meanwhile, the Deputy Attorney General wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he despised the hatred and bigotry that had driven those officers to torment innocent lives. Their actions represented everything wrong with the system he'd dedicated his career to fixing. On the other hand, he believed deeply in due process and fairness. Violence, even against those who deserved it, only perpetuated the cycle of harm. Still, he couldn't deny the sense of unease settling in his chest. The anonymous note weighed heavily on his mind, and the stories of the van following officers left him uneasy. Was someone out there taking justice into their own hands? And if so, where would it end? Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued. Evidence mounted against the officers, and Internal Affairs prepared to recommend disciplinary action. Public pressure remained high, with protests erupting outside police headquarters and calls for reform echoing nationwide. For the first time in years, it seemed possible that real change might come, but then, late one night, the unthinkable happened. Late one night, the news broke 2 officers from the precinct were found dead. Their patrol car had been abandoned on a remote road, its doors wide open and lights still flashing. The bodies lay nearby, partially hidden by the dense trees lining the area. Investigators arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they examined the scene. It didn't take long to piece together what had happened. Both officers had been shot. Execution-style. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Some saw the killings as justice served, a grim reckoning for years of unchecked abuse. Others condemned the violence, arguing that it undermined the very principles of fairness and accountability the Deputy Attorney General had fought so hard to uphold. For him, the news was devastating. He hadn't wished harm on anyone, not even those who had wronged him, but he couldn't ignore the fact that their deaths had shifted the narrative entirely. As details emerged, investigators linked the murders to a shadowy figure rumored to target abusive law enforcement officials. Known only by whispers and cryptic messages left at crime scenes, this person or group operated with chilling efficiency. They seemed to know everything about their victims, their schedules, their habits, their darkest secrets, and they showed no mercy. For the Deputy Attorney General, the situation became even more complicated. Rumors swirled that the vigilante might have been inspired by his case. Supporters online speculated that the anonymous note he'd received weeks earlier could be connected to the killings. Journalists hounded him for answers, asking if he felt responsible or if he secretly condoned the violence. Each question weighed heavily on him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of seeking justice. "I never wanted this," he said during a press conference, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. What happened to those officers is tragic, regardless of their actions. Violence solves nothing, it only creates more pain. My goal has always been to fix the system, not tear it apart. His words resonated with many, but not everyone agreed. Critics accused him of being naive, claiming that reform wasn't enough to address decades of systemic corruption. Supporters, meanwhile, praised his commitment to peaceful change, urging others to follow his lead. Amidst the chaos, he remained steadfast in his mission to use the tragedy as a catalyst for meaningful reform. With public attention at an all-time high, the Deputy Attorney General worked tirelessly to push for sweeping changes within the police department. He collaborated with lawmakers, activists, and community leaders to draft new policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Body cameras would become mandatory for all officers. Independent oversight boards would review complaints against law enforcement. Training programs would focus on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, but implementing these reforms wasn't easy. Resistance came from unexpected places, including within the department itself. Some officers argued that the measures went too far, painting them as villains instead of protectors. Others feared losing their jobs or facing unfair scrutiny. Tensions ran high, and protests erupted on both sides of the issue. Through it all, the Deputy Attorney General stayed focused. He held town hall meetings, listening to concerns from citizens and law enforcement alike. He shared stories of families torn apart by police misconduct, hoping to humanize the statistics and headlines. Slowly but surely, progress began to take shape. New policies were adopted, albeit reluctantly by some. Community relations improved, though scars remained. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, sitting alone in his office, he replayed the events leading up to the officers' deaths. Had he missed an opportunity to prevent the tragedy? Could he have done more to stop the cycle of violence before it spiraled out of control? These questions haunted him, reminders of the heavy burden he carried. Yet, despite the weight of it all, he refused to give up. Change was possible, it just required patience, perseverance, and courage. And while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he believed deeply in the power of collective action. Together, they could build a future where no one had to fear being pulled over simply because of how they looked. A future where justice truly meant fairness for everyone. One evening, as he prepared to leave the office, his phone buzzed with a notification. Another anonymous message had appeared online, this time addressed directly to him. "Your fight isn't over, neither is ours." He stared at the screen, a mixture of dread and determination washing over him. Whoever was behind the vigilante, killings hadn't stopped, not yet. And while he couldn't condone their methods, he understood the anger driving them. Somewhere out there, someone still believed the system was beyond saving, but for now, he chose to focus on the battles he could win, on rebuilding trust one step at a time, on proving that justice didn't have to come at the cost of bloodshed. As he walked out into the cool night air, he reminded himself why he'd started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about fear. It was about hope. Hope, he realized, was worth fighting for even in the face of darkness.